Missing person cases that are solved can give hope that there are answers to even the strangest missing person cases. Sometimes those answers can come from unusual places. Number 5. Lee Tracy Miley was reported missing by her son Craig in 2019. She had actually disappeared some 30 years earlier, though. There isn't a whole lot of information available about this case, but Lee Tracy had lived in Bournemouth, England, with her 2 children up until 1991. That year, she made a trip to Egypt for a vacation before moving to Cyprus, where her family were under the impression she intended to settle down. Her children, Craig and Christina, never saw their mother again. It was as if she had vanished without a trace. As they got older, the question of what happened to their mother lingered, even as they started families of their own. They began a private investigation to try to solve the mystery. Craig even tried to use a TV show to get answers. Over the years, they heard multiple rumors about what might have happened to her. Many were contradictory and left the siblings no closer to getting any answers. In 2019, Craig figured the only option was to file a missing person report with the local police. Investigators took up the case despite the amount of time that had passed since Lee Tracy had vanished. They looked for government records of the missing person and found that she had been living in London for a time in 2003. When they went to the location, there was no sign of Lee Tracy or anybody who had known her. She had been issued a passport that same year, and it expired in 2013 without being renewed. It was clear Lee Tracy, or at least someone using her name, was still alive, but police were getting no closer to finding out where she actually was. Finally, police discovered that she had applied for and been granted a visa to live in the US. All the information pointed to Arizona. Police in the US were contacted and located Lee Tracy. Miraculously, this was the same woman who had left her children all those years ago, not an imposter. Lee Tracy had a very strange story of her own. While in Cyprus, she'd had a car accident. It had left her in a coma for a time, and when she woke up, she had no memory of her life before. Presumably, she had an ID with her as she knew her name and that she was from the UK, but apparently had forgotten her family. It's not clear if the memories ever returned, but years later, Lee Tracy did try to reach out to her family. They had moved from their previous address though, and she had no way of contacting them. Her children are just happy to finally have answers and solve this missing person case with a happy ending. Number 4. The disappearance of Bruno Borges was one of Brazil's strangest missing person cases from recent years. Even after he was found, less than 6 months after he vanished, it was a case with questions that remained unanswered. Bruno was a 24-year-old student when he disappeared in March of 2017. Before he vanished, he was last seen on March 27th, the day his parents returned from a 3-week vacation. The family had lunch together, then Bruno's father dropped him off at the corner of the street. He walked away without any money or any personal documents. It was a little later that day when Bruno's parents went into his room to find an extremely strange situation. When they left for their vacation, it had been an ordinary bedroom. Now all of the furniture had been removed, the walls were covered in writing, and there was a statue of a 16th century philosopher in the center. But there was no sign of Bruno. In the years leading up to his disappearance, Bruno had been working on a secret project. He was writing a book which he promised would change the world for the better. He would ask relatives for money to complete the project, but most wouldn't give him anything without at least knowing what it was. In the end, his cousin funded the project after reading 15 pages of the book and enjoying it. Found in the room when Bruno vanished were 14 handwritten books. They were each filled with coded words, and on the front covers were red Roman numerals indicating the order. The writing on the walls, ceilings, and floors were copied from those same books. The statue of the philosopher was something Bruno had had specially made. It was a copy of a statue of Giordano Bruno, one of the first philosophers to speculate about life on other planets. When his parents went to the sculptor who made the statue, he said he believed Bruno was a reincarnation of the philosopher. A video of Bruno's room was leaked online, prompting speculation that Bruno had been abducted by aliens or had been secreted away by the CIA. On August 11th, Bruno returned to the family home. He was barefoot and lost weight and was dehydrated. He told people he had been on a spiritual journey and thought that his family and friends would assume that that was the case. Police suspected the whole thing had been put together for publicity for Bruno's book. Whatever the case, what he was really doing during those 5 months of disappearance, how he came to be in such poor health, and how much truth there is in his mysterious writings are only things that Bruno knows. Number 3. The disappearance of Konstantinos Filippidis is a solved missing person case that still leaves behind plenty of mystery. Konstantinos was a firefighter from Toronto when he disappeared in 2018. He and some other off-duty and retired firefighters headed down to New York for their annual skiing trip that February. Most of the ski trip went off without any problems, but on the last day, something strange happened. Some of the other people on the trip were ready to call it a day at about 2:30 p.m. as they were tired. Konstantinos told them that he wanted one more go on the slope. They went their separate ways, and it would be the last time that Konstantinos was seen for almost a week. The rest of the group waited at the ski lodge for their friend. A few hours later, Konstantinos still hadn't shown up, and the others grew concerned. There had been a strong snowstorm on the mountain, which had made visibility poor. There was no news of an avalanche or anything dramatic, but that didn't mean something hadn't happened to Konstantinos. A search of the mountain began, but there was no trace of him. There was no sign of him on the mountain, so the group went back to the resort where they had been staying. There, they found his car and personal belongings, and it seemed like he was still on the mountain. News of the disappearance spread back to Toronto, and within days, 100 firefighters from the area had volunteered to help search the mountain for Konstantinos. His wife also came down to New York to try to find him. 6 days passed from Konstantinos' initial disappearance before the mystery would be solved. At least where he had disappeared to was solved. Konstantinos called his wife from a number she didn't recognize. He explained that he was in Sacramento, California, more than 4,600 kilometers away. Konstantinos would later explain that he had hit his head on the mountain at some point and become disoriented. He went to what he thought was the ski lodge, but found that the lodge was closed. For some reason, he decided to hitch a ride into town. Dressed in his ski gear, he had gotten into a truck, and from there, his memory was hazy. He was ill and suffering from a serious headache. The next clear memory that he had was the truck driver saying that they had arrived in Utah. The truck driver took him all the way to Sacramento before saying that he couldn't go any further. Konstantinos had his credit card with him and used it to purchase a new phone, as his old one was still in New York. Finally, he managed to get a hold of his wife. She told him to contact police and explain that he was a missing person. It was less than a week before Konstantinos was reunited with his family and eventually returned back to Canada. There are still lots of unknowns in this case. It's not known why Konstantinos suffered memory loss or decided to travel all the way to California. Police have tried to find the mystery trucker that made the journey with him, but they've had no such luck. Konstantinos has put his disappearance behind him though, and has returned to duty as a firefighter. Number 2. Jermaine Mann was just 21 months old when he disappeared without a trace on June 24, 1987. For more than 30 years, his mother Lyneth searched for her son, but in 2018, she received the news she never thought she was going to hear. Jermaine's disappearance was caused by the most common form of abduction, where a non-custodial parent takes their child. In this case, it was his father, Alan Mann, who snatched the small child. Alan and Lyneth had separated about a year earlier, and Lyneth had been awarded custody of their son. Alan still got to see him in court-ordered visits, though. That June day, Alan was supposed to pick up Jermaine and take his son to his mother's house for a visit. When they didn't return later that day, Lyneth contacted authorities. It was discovered that neither Jermaine nor Alan had made it to his mother's house, and they had both vanished. The RCMP and Toronto police took up the missing person case right away, but there was little information to go on. It was suspected Allen may have fled south into the United States. Allen himself was an immigrant and had joint citizenship, but he had family living in the United States. U.S. law enforcement also got involved with the case, but there were few leads to follow and the case went cold. Lyneth never gave up the search for her son, though. Several times over the decades, there were appeals for information, and an age progression photo of Jermaine was released, but it wasn't until 2016 that progress was made. A new investigation began after a joint fugitive task force meeting between Canadian and U.S. officials. Investigators began by interviewing Allen's family members again, and this time they got somewhere. One suggested the name Haley D'Souza, a man living in Connecticut. D'Souza claimed to be from Texas. He had one son. He was also born in the state. His son's mother passed away shortly after he was born, and he said he had a degree but couldn't find work and was living in a quiet suburb when police began to investigate him. Comparing his driver's license to a 1987 photo of Jermaine Mann convinced authorities that these were the same person. Then D'Souza applied for some housing benefits using his birth certificate. D'Souza had applied for housing and Medicare aid multiple times over the years, but this time the birth certificate was flagged as being fake. D'Souza's fingerprints were taken, and finally authorities were able to confirm this was Jermaine Mann. Allen was arrested for falsifying documents and abduction. Jermaine was finally found living and working not too far away. Allen had lied to his son all of his life, and Jermaine had never realized he was a missing person. He was reunited with his mother and remarked that he had her eyes. Number 1. For more than a decade, Benjamin Kyle was one of the most famous people in America, but nobody, including Benjamin, knew who he was. He was a person missing his identity, and amateur and professional investigators alike were sure that he was a missing person waiting to be found. Benjamin was discovered lying outside of a Burger King in Georgia on August 31st, 2004. He had no clothing, no personal identification, and was covered in fire ants. When he was taken to the hospital, he had no memory of who he was or how he came to be outside the Burger King that day. There were a few details about him that he was certain of, though. The name Benjamin, spelled with 2 A's, seemed right, and he was sure his birthday was August 29th, 1948. He had a feeling that he was from Indianapolis and had a connection to Boulder, Colorado, but nothing more. Benjamin wound up in a homeless shelter, where he worked hard to make himself useful. People took pity on him and tried to help him find his identity. A genealogist named Colleen Fitzpatrick tried to use genetic genealogy to trace Benjamin's past. Despite numerous searches, she couldn't get close to Benjamin's true identity. An argument broke out between Fitzpatrick and Benjamin when she allegedly refused to take him to see his own genetic profile or share her findings with other researchers. Benjamin eventually left Georgia and moved to Florida, where he got to work at a restaurant. It wasn't until 2015 that the truth was finally revealed. Benjamin had long since stopped corresponding with Fitzpatrick, but was still in contact with other genetic genealogists, including a woman named Cece Moore. They had managed to determine that Benjamin was related to the Powell family, but hadn't been able to narrow it down too far. After all, the family was made up of hundreds of people. Moore and Fitzpatrick continued to argue about Benjamin's case in public forums. Another genetic genealogist with the name Powell had come across one of these arguments. She was on the way to a family reunion and reached out to Moore, offering to take DNA samples of her relatives. This finally led to the breakthrough Benjamin needed. In September of 2016, Moore reached out to him again and gave him a name, William Burgess Powell. William had been missing since the 1970s. He was one of 4 children, born to Marjorie and Furman Powell in Indiana. Growing up, he had been his mother's favorite, which had drawn the anger of his father. When he was 16, he left home but stayed in town where he was raised. He worked odd jobs around town and moved into a mobile home on the property of a family called the Richardsons. He would have dinner with the Richardsons, but mostly kept to himself. When he didn't come for dinner one night in 1976, the family came to check on him, but he was nowhere to be found. A missing persons report was filed, but William was soon found. He had moved to Boulder with a friend and was working at a restaurant, and he didn't want to come back. A few years later, the friend returned to Indiana, and William seemed to disappear off the face of the earth. Years later, one of his brothers tried to use his military contacts to find William. The last trace of him was from 1983. After that, he hadn't used his social security card. The brother had assumed that William must have passed away. After discovering his true identity, Benjamin reunited with his brother and eventually moved back to Indiana to look after him. He still doesn't remember what happened between his last job in 1983 and waking up in 2004, but has come to the conclusion the mystery is something his mind doesn't want him to solve. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you liked this video, be sure to hit that like button. Also, don't forget to subscribe and click that notification bell to keep up to date with all of our future uploads. But my name is Ty Knotts, and I'll catch you guys in the next video.